Well, Jerry Schwartzbach, welcome to the Killer Cross-Examination Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
So I want to sort of begin this podcast by saying, first of all, I always thought Beretta was, Robert Blake and Beretta was like one of the coolest guys out there. I didn't know that he was actually, until I read your book, that he was actually in Little Rascals.
Oh,
I didn't know that
he was a celebrity since he was, I think, about 4 years old.
Tell me, if you would, how the beginning of how you met Robert Blake and how you came into that case is chronicled by you in your memoir, which is called Leaning the Arc. Is that right?
Leaning on the Arc.
Leaning on the Arc.
A personal history of criminal defense.
So first of all, tell me about, I have to ask, the title Leaning on the Arc. Where does that come from? What's the significance of that to you?
Well, the significance to me was that it comes from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, in which he stated that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So the meaning for me was, this was my contribution to trying to cause the arc of the moral universe to bend more towards justice.
So I know you've handled some really significant cases. Some are just so, because I want to talk to you about some of these. Obviously, you represented Robert Blake. We know that, and obtained an acquittal at a trial for him. I believe you also represented Stephen Bingham, who a pretty well-known case in California that ended up garnering significant attention from the media for a variety of reasons. And I want to ask you about that. And one of the cases that I could tell caused you to have some of the most profound, I think really a profound impact on criminal justice in the trial courts, was perhaps one of, if not the first, actual defense to a jury, successful defense to a jury of the battered wife syndrome. And I believe that case was Dolores Churchill, was a case you took on. Those were three cases that I read about that are just fascinating. There's an interesting thread through all of them, and that is that you really believe in attempting to speak on behalf of people who are accused of a crime. And in a way, it really comes through that you view yourself as sort of an extension of them in the courtroom and their ability to get their story and to get a sense of justice. And I want you to take us back, if you would, to where that started. Where did it start that you were that you viewed the legal system? Where did you come to view the legal system as a place for attempting not just to affect social change, because I know people talk about that, but really to affect change in an individual case, in an individual person's life?
Well, initially it starts with the fact that as a child, first of all, I'm Jewish, and I think that has had a significant impact on me even as a child, because I identified with oppressed people. I've always had a strong sense of justice, as trite as that might sound. I also was an athlete in my youth. I played basketball and baseball through college. I only went to law school, frankly, because I was unwilling to go to Vietnam and fight what I thought was an immoral war, excuse me. And I wanted to be a sportscaster because, for reasons that still escape me, no NBA team, no Major League Baseball team contacted me. I couldn't understand it. I mean, shit, I was almost 5'6". And when I told my older brother that what I wanted to do, he said, "Well, that's great. The first game you announce is going to be in Vietnam." I applied for law school, Um, I didn't like law school. It seemed to me that, and they impressed on our class, which was a large class at George Washington University, in an initial meeting, that's important to get the good grades, to get the good jobs, to make the big money, et cetera. And that just didn't interest me at all. And I actually was going to quit after my first year, but I had stopped studying after Thanksgiving. I thought that was pretty good. I studied for September, October, and November. I mean, what else do you have to do? But I wasn't studying, and as it turned out, I flunked a course my second semester. And although I had been offered a high school basketball coaching job and teaching job, which I was going to accept, being as mature then as I am now, I'm very competitive, and I was very upset about the failure to pass that one class. I went to summer school. I decided I'd go back for my second year and do well and then quit. And but when I went back, that was really the transformation for me, and more directly responsive to your question. I became involved in what may have been one of the very first clinical law programs in a law school in the country. It was coordinated among the 5 Washington, D.C. law schools. I became very much involved in that, and I had grown up in a small town in northeastern Pennsylvania with small town values. You know, if you don't lie, if you work hard. And I remember when I was in law school, my family didn't have a legal background. My father was in the pants bath, in the schmata business. And but he had died when I was 14. And when I would come home, I came home on a vacation from law school, and I went to see my grandfather, who lived in the same town as we did. And when he realized, he had dementia, but when he realized who I was and that I was in law school, he said to me, "You're going to be a lawyer? You be a good lawyer. You be an honest lawyer. You be somebody people can trust." And to me, that's the best legal advice I have ever received. And when I spent a great deal of time my second year in law school in the Washington, D.C. housing projects, public housing projects. And when I saw how unfairly, horribly, the legal system, the economic system, the political system treated poor people and people of color, having that athletic background and being very competitive, I realized that being a lawyer was a vehicle by which I could fight for people like that and do something meaningful with my life.
It's amazing. And I know part of that journey ended up bringing you to Detroit.
It did.
Where you practiced.
Thanks to Richard Nixon. When I was in law school, I had applied and been accepted into a program that would have had me being a staff attorney in South Florida representing migrant farm workers. But Richard Nixon got elected president and he defunded the program. I had also applied to be a VISTA volunteer, a volunteer in service to America. And this was 1969. And I said I'd go anywhere in the country, fully expecting I'd end up in the Deep South, where they were killing or attempting to kill civil rights workers. But they ended up sending me to Detroit. And Detroit was a very meaningful place and time in my life. I had a moral foundation. I didn't really have a political one. It's where I became very politically involved, and that's where I learned to be a lawyer and where my mentor as a lawyer was a great lawyer by the name of Sheldon Otis.
So I understand it. You ended up moving to, I think Sheldon Otis ended up moving out to California at some point, and you ended up also moving out to California. I don't know if you guys actually worked together in California, but I know you ended up moving out to California and ultimately ended up settling in San Francisco. Did you, the two of you, work together in California?
We did, but not initially. When I first passed the bar, I worked for an organization in the Bayview Hunters Point section of San Francisco, which is predominantly poor and predominantly Black. And it was the alternative to the public defender for people who lived in that area. I worked there from 1974 to 76. Sheldon then opened up his own law practice in San Francisco, asked me to join him there. And he had a somewhat unique system. We had two trial teams. He and I were each trial lawyers, and we each had a lawyer who would do our legal research and writing. And I worked.
He was the first one that's just so we can put a timestamp on this so we can tell how advanced this focus on trial practice was as opposed to what we see nowadays. What year did you and Sheldon Otis work together in this practice in California? This was in the 70s?
1976.
And in 1976, the idea, as I understood it from your book, was Sheldon had set up two trial teams with a trial lawyer who was sort of the head of both of those teams, a lawyer who was an associate or someone that would do work underneath you. And then there was also an assistant that would help out here and there. And he had actually constructed a mock trial room in which you would actually be able to visualize the work of the lawyers, the witnesses, and your clients as they were to see how they would look and sound through testifying. I mean, it really is pretty advanced. I mean, it's amazing because that's what people do nowadays.
Yeah, it was, I'm not aware, there may have been somebody else who was doing it at the time. I wasn't aware of anyone else who did it. And it was, there were two cameras, one on the witness stand and one on the lawyer. And so you were able to see and hear both. And it was really quite valuable.
I want to ask you about some, obviously I know some of the cases that you've been involved in. I've read your book, I've read articles, I've read some stories about cross-examinations you've conducted. But I think one of the things that I noticed from our conversations before we actually began this conversation was you have a unique style. Now, when I say unique, not bombastic, not copying off of somebody else. So I want to sort of lay some groundwork as to how important it is for lawyers to be themselves as much as that is possible, as opposed to trying to copy somebody else's style. So I think this is a perfect place to start, because I'm sure Sheldon Otis and you have totally different personalities or had different personalities. And what was his personality and what is yours? And if you could, how did you find use for yourself in the courtroom? How'd you find your own voice?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that. It's an important question because I don't know whether or not people still do it, but there was a period of time where lawyers or theatrical people were teaching lawyers how to essentially act and talk in court and how to be persuasive in court. I never believed in that. What my style is I don't have a style. I'm just me. And the really important thing that I learned from Sheldon was to be thoroughly prepared. There are many lawyers as I'm sure you're aware, who think the best way to get over the anxiety of going to trial, and as you can appreciate, there's a lot of anxiety. It For me, the best way to get over the anxiety is to be as prepared as you can possibly be, to try to anticipate every conceivable factual and legal issue that might come up and be prepared to deal with it. In terms of style, I'm just me. Um, I, I don't try to be anybody else. Sheldon had a very different personality. It worked for him. Um, he was a brilliant lawyer. I think he was a better lawyer than me. At least I always thought so.
Well, and it's funny because when you and I started talking about interviewing you on the podcast, you really were so humble, almost to a point that I looked at like, I have the right guy, right? I mean, I'm actually talking to the right lawyer because you've made some real significant contributions to individual lives and some really important Supreme Court cases. Um, but I remember the quote. I was asking you, and you said, "Well, I mean, I'm not one of those like high profile, TV lawyers. Yet when you stack up your verdicts and your accomplishments, they, in a lot of ways, they really weigh heavily. They tip heavily in your favor."
Well, that's kind of you to say. I will. You had asked how I became Robert's lawyer. Actually, my wife and I were on a very brief vacation of a few days down in the Palm Springs area, where I had a cousin from the East Coast who had rented a double condo and invited us. I didn't have enough money. I never focused on money. I just always felt if I was a good person, an honest person, I was a hardworking lawyer, I treated people fairly, somehow life would work out. And I just never focused on money when people were buying income property, and it was never entered my head.
Businessman versus lawyer, right?
Yeah, my brother.
People out there that are businessmen. Then there are some people that just want to do the cases. They want to do the work, and they want to just be in court and work the cases. And sometimes those are sometimes they're mutually exclusive in some people's lives.
Well, I can give you a couple examples, not to brag, but it's just factually accurate. I was not Stephen. Stephen Bingham was a lawyer. He's a non-practicing lawyer now. Stephen's retired, but you disappeared for a second. Anyway, he came from a very prestigious family from Connecticut. Everybody went to Yale. He was the radical who turned down Yale Law School and went to Bolt, University of California's law school in Berkeley. And he was very much involved in the farm workers fight. He was involved with Cesar Chavez. He was very political, a very genteel person. He was initially represented by Leonard Weinglass, who was one of the lawyers who's actually portrayed in the movie Chicago 8. And he had a second counsel who was a very good San Francisco lawyer. That lawyer developed a medical problem and needed to get out. And for whatever reason, I was contacted and asked, and I came in originally as second counsel, but then for personal reasons, Len left the case, and Stephen asked me to be his lead counsel, and so I was. I had cut a financial deal with Stephen for a certain amount of money per month. I had an office in San Francisco. I had an associate who worked for me. I had a secretary who worked for me. This is pre-computers. I had a complete federal and state law library. And the financial deal I cut with Stephen was on a monthly basis. And I should have talked to somebody who understood business, because I just lost money every month. And people were telling me, you need to renegotiate. Yeah.
I want to ask you about that case because it's an incredible case. He was tell me this is an accurate backdrop. He was a lawyer. He still is a lawyer, but at the time he was a lawyer. He was representing somebody in jail who was in prison, I believe. And he ultimately ended up being wrongly accused, or he was accused of smuggling in or aiding in the smuggling in of a weapon that an inmate used in prison to, I think it was to engage in a riot or incite a riot that also resulted in the death of, it may have been one or two inmates, and the allegation was a couple of guards. And then he fled the country was the argument. He left the country against the backdrop of what he thought would be in the impossibility of him getting a fair trial at that time with J. Edgar Hoover, who was the FBI director, and ultimately came back, and you tried that case. Is that a fair summary of the case?
Well, it's a general summary of the case. The inmate was George Jackson, who was very well known. Stephen wasn't even supposed to go visit him on that day. He was asked to go to San Quentin prison to help an investigator get in to visit George. So he went. As it turned out, he couldn't help her get in, but she had a tape recorder. George was writing a book, and she wanted him to record certain things. So Stephen went in. He eventually left and went to have lunch with an aunt and uncle. And by the time he came back to the place where he was living, he found out that the afternoon San Francisco newspaper had his photograph on the front page, and was talking about how multiple guards, 2 white inmates, and actually Jackson were all dead. And Stephen, they were just assuming Stephen smuggled a gun into him. And so he was, the people he was living with and others helped to get him out of the country, and he lived out of the country for many years before he came back to go to trial.
Jerry, how did you deal with
just to finish the other thought, not to interrupt?
Yeah, please.
I was going broke representing Stephen, and people were telling me you had to renegotiate because you're going to go broke. And I said, I can't. I cut a deal with the guy, and it would be unfair to him, for me to attempt to renegotiate when I had all this leverage over him, because whether he lived or died, because if he went to prison, he would have been murdered. I think everyone believed that. His guards had been killed. And I just couldn't do that. And so I never renegotiated with him. We obtained an acquittal. My associate had to leave to get a job where he could get paid. My secretary left to get a job where she can get paid, and I was broke. But I had kept my word, and I had done what I was supposed to do as a lawyer.
Tell me about there's one of the things that I read in your book was that you had to overcome the consciousness of guilt issue, which is really a jury instruction that says that if a person leaves or doesn't respond to a charge, that it's like a normative judgment that's evidence of consciousness of guilt, that you may or may not accept that. And the jury, of course, could turn that down, and you could argue it could be something else. But when a judge tells the jury You can use that evidence to show that they knew that they had done something wrong if you choose to. How did you overcome that? What were the obstacles in that case, and how did you use cross-examination to overcome the fact that there was that he had done nothing wrong? There really was no evidence. They were trying just to create a supposition and conjecture, and the fact that he left was they were attempting to use that to show that he must have done it.
I'm not sure. I know your focus is on cross-examination, but I think the real answer to that question was Stephen's testimony. And he testified why he left. And he was convinced, he had been convinced he would be incarcerated, he would be convicted, and he would be killed. He would never get a fair trial. And so it was other people who persuaded him he needed to leave. And he stayed away for an extended period of times. He was he initially was in Eastern Europe because Interpol was looking for him. He spent 10 years in Paris as a house painter. He wasn't painting portraits, he was painting houses. And he went to school and studied film, and he produced 2 documentaries that were, one of them was about a large corporation that had been in a small town, and for financial reasons, they just closed up shop and left all their employees without any money and devastated this town. And that was the documentary that he produced. And of course, he had an alias during all that time. The reason he came back was while he was gone, his mother died. And he was heartbroken that he could not, he wasn't with her before she died, when she died, and he wasn't able to attend her funeral. His father was getting elderly, and he was prepared to risk his life to come back to be able to see his father and have a relationship with him before his father ultimately died. And he's such a good person. And it just oozes out of him. There's nothing phony about him. I mean, even after Stephen was acquitted, he spent his entire legal career representing poor people in legal aid and representing homeless people in San Francisco. And so I think it was, that was the primary reason. There were a number of, significant cross-examinations that occurred, obviously, during the trial. But I think that was the primary reason that the jury did not presume that his leaving the country was a consciousness of guilt. It was more a consciousness of fear.
So Stephen Bingham, I remember he testified, he thought he had testified pretty well and was able to explain himself. Did you think he would make a good witness as you were approaching the trial? Did you know? Were you unsure? Kind of walk me through that.
I thought Stephen would be a wonderful witness just by being himself. When I became his lead counsel, I took him, there's a large park in San Francisco called Golden Gate Park. And I took him there, and we just sat on a bench, and I said, tell me about your life, and I will tell you whatever you want to know about me and my life. And there's one question I didn't ask him to answer, which was, why did he come back? Because I knew how emotional that was, and I didn't want that emotion to come out in Golden Gate Park. I wanted it to come out in the courtroom when he was on the witness stand, because I knew it was real.
Amazing. And tell me, if you would, I know, so that was obviously a decision or a strategy that you had taken early on in your representation of him. was
Yes.
to not ask him that question for fear that he would get it out, it would come out naturally, and then after he took the stand and asked that question again, that he would not seem as genuine, not because he was lying, but just because it would seem more, he'd already been over that ground one time, right?
Correct. Correct.
And an interesting dichotomy is that you had concerns in the Dolores Churchill case, which is a fascinating case. Was trying to look up the background in Dolores Churchill's case, of course, is that she was a battered woman. The case was, I mean, the story, the way, and I'm sure your memoir doesn't even begin to touch how awfully she was treated by her husband. But you made a decision in that case. One, you relied on a battered wife syndrome, battered woman spouse syndrome to establish self-defense. And the second was that she did testify, and you were concerned about her testimony because she would have to reveal all this awful information, how badly she had been treated, and all the psychological issues that she would have to face disclosing that, not just to a jury in a courtroom, but to her family, others, and the public, because there were cameras in the courtroom. Did you practice that with her, or did you let her just tell her story and accept it the way it would come out?
I don't have a specific recollection, but I'm sure I prepared her to testify, prepared what I was going to ask her and go over it. Her husband, by the way, was a police officer. And things that he did to her, I won't describe in this interview, but they were far beyond demeaning. It would, and for whatever reason, it was the first trial that ever had television camera in the courtroom during a trial. But for whatever reason, they weren't there the day she testified. And I had objected to there being cameras because I didn't want Dolores to have to go through that. And by the way, I represented her for free because she had a court-appointed lawyer. She is not a good lawyer. She was the head of at the time, the only shelter for battered women in San Francisco, had been trying to find her a lawyer but she didn't have money and she was having difficulty, and somebody must have said, well, there's this schmuck on Union Street who might do it. And that was me. And so the executive director brought Dolores to my office, and it would have been horrible for her to have to describe that to anybody, to describe it to a man, and Dolores was Black, and to describe it to a white man, because I needed to know everything. It was quite moving. It was quite compelling. And I had not yet agreed to represent her, but once I met her, once I heard her story, and she actually had shot her husband in the lobby of a downtown San Francisco office building. I don't know, I'm just me. And there was just no way that I could not do it. There, another case you may eventually ask about, but I'll just jump into it, is I represented a fellow who had been wrongfully convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He was a racist and anti-Semite when I met him. And I represented him for many years, somewhere, depending upon how you measure them, 8 or 13 years. And lost throughout the state system, but eventually had his conviction set aside due to prosecutorial and police misconduct. And people would say to me, wow, they were so impressed that I did that. All those years, spent my own money, had to borrow money from my brother, who was always my source, always paid him back. He's my big brother. What else are big brothers good for? I represented Buddy for free. And
So Buddy
said,
Nickerson.
Buddy Nickerson, and people said that was just amazing. How could you do that? And to me, how could I not? I was the only human being on the face of the earth who had the education, the training, the experience, and knew the case inside out because I had represented the person who had actually committed the murder in a case in which they were seeking the death penalty. How could I not do it?
I was going to ask you about your opening, and I've seen this in a couple different of your, at least your descriptions of cross-examinations of key witnesses against clients of yours. For example, I believe in the Churchill case, you began by questioning her husband, and you asked him a question, which was essentially he couldn't win the answer. It'd be impossible for him to have won the answer. I think the opening question that you put to him was something like, is it your testimony that you have never laid your hand on Dolores? Something like that. And
actually, it was different. I asked him a question that was clearly objectionable. And the question was, when was the first time you beat up Dolores? There was an objection, assumes facts, not in evidence. Sustained. No, you have beaten up Dolores, haven't you? Now, I had a whole bunch of witnesses who could corroborate, but that led him down a path of denial after denial after denial, which set him up for impeachment after impeachment after impeachment.
And he tried to say that they had scuffled, right? They had scuffled, or no, sorry, that they'd engaged in mutual combat or something. He described it as mutual assault or mutual combat or mutual scuffling or something like that. And you pushed back on him and said, I'm not asking you that. I'm asking about you. And then you essentially forced an answer, and then you just impeached him over time with all these horrible things that he had said and done about how he threatened to use his position and nobody would believe her. And he'd walk out of this, and he had the police force behind him. And by the time you were done cross-examining him, his credibility was really, not only was it clear that he was a batterer and an abusive guy, but it seemed pretty clear that he was willing to lie about it in court.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And go ahead, because I read that's a similar interesting tactic you've taken in some other cases. I know you cross-examined a guy who threatened you.
Right. I was just going to get to that. That was in the Richard Bandler case. Richard Bandler was the co-founder of something called neuro-linguistic programming. And he was accused of shooting a woman, killing her. And they had a substantial amount of evidence to corroborate that accusation. He and another fellow were together with the woman at the time that she was shot. And the other fellow had gone to the police and said, Richard had done it, and told them where the gun was, and et cetera. And they found a number of other things that were not helpful. They went to Richard's house with a search warrant. They found the gun. They found clothing with the woman's blood and body material on his clothing in a closet. They got a blood sample from him. He had cocaine and marijuana in his system, etc. And there was a tape recorder, which was a voice-activated tape recorder, and they just grabbed it. They didn't really have a particular reason. And when they eventually played it, it had recorded an argument that Richard had had with this woman just hours before she was killed. So there was a lot of evidence against him. This other fellow, had been interviewed in a very well-publicized article that was on the front page of the San Jose Mercury News Sunday magazine. And in it, he referred to me as, fucking little Jew boy. And, and if he keeps, fucking around, the same thing that happened to Doreen can happen to him, etc.
He didn't know that you were a prominent athlete from your youth.
Yeah, but he wasn't blind. He could see he was twice my size. Anyway, he was obviously the key witness in the prosecution, but he didn't show up for trial, and the prosecution couldn't find him. And over my objection, the judge granted them a 1-week stay of the trial so they could find him.
In the middle of the trial.
In the middle of the trial. And I, in fact, my wife was, you can understand, quite worried about my safety. And I had asked the judge, and that article had come out the day before we began trial. And when there was the courtroom was full of prospective jurors and we're in chambers with the judge, everybody knew about the article. And the judge, who was a former prosecutor, he had been actually the prosecutor of that county. He was a good guy, and he was quite offended about it. And I said to him, look, I know there's only so much you can do, but my wife has asked me to ask you to do whatever you can to keep me safe while I'm in or about the courthouse. And anyway, this other fellow hadn't shown up. They eventually did find him. The courtroom was packed every day. It was a big celebrity case in the Santa Cruz. It was in Santa Cruz. So the guy testified on direct examination. And my very first question to him, I got up, this was not normally I will stand, if I'm examining a witness, I'll stand with the jury in between me and the witness, because I have a tendency not to speak very loudly. I wanted to make sure that the witness heard me. If the witness heard me, the jury heard me. If I heard the witness, the jury heard the witness. And so my first question to him was, are you going to kill me, Mr. Marino? And he said no. And then I took him through all the quotes that had been in that article, in which he has said these terrible and threatening things about me and anti-Semitic things about me, and had essentially said that my life was at risk. And of course, when I asked that first question, the prosecutor said, objection, and the courtroom was huge uproar, although, it was full and everyone was all excited and stuff. And the judge hammers the courtroom to order and then overruled the objection.
And one of the interesting things is I remember you had, I think your argument was that it shows bias. It's relevant to show, it shows the witness's bias against you and your client. I mean, if he made that statement. So it's not just some wild, hey, have you lied about whether you stole an ice cream cone, 8 years ago? I mean, this is literally something he said about you. And he either could choose to admit it, or he could choose to deny it.
If he denied it, then I would have been able to bring in the reporter, but he didn't deny it. He said he was just joking, that he wasn't really serious about that.
Which leads to an interesting observation of mine. At one point, I don't know if it was in that trial or another, but you said something in response to a judge talking to you about the volume of your voice. And at one point, I believe a judge had said
that was in Richard's. That was in my closing argument in Robert Blake's case. And during the judge, before I was not Robert's first lawyer. And before I got in the case, the judge had ruled that Court TV, which was in existence at the time, could televise opening statement, closing arguments, and the verdict live on national television. And the courtroom was full for closing argument. The courtroom was full of media. And at some point during my closing argument, the judge apologized for interrupting me, but said that there were people in the back of the courtroom who were having difficulty hearing me. And I just said to the judge, with due respect, Your Honor, the people I'm concerned about hearing me are these folks over here, which was the jury.
Now, when I hear that, I'm not even on the jury, and I get sort of a warm feeling, and I get the hair on the back of my neck stands up, or the hairs stand up, because I can sense how genuine that is. And if I was on the jury, how meaningful it is to have the lawyer say, not these are the people, you, and you're the ones who matter.
Yeah.
I've noticed throughout some of you just talked about how you stood to the side, you have the jury between you and the witness. We talked about some of the questions you've asked. And so when I think to all those questions, that common theme is, if I were a juror, what do I want you to ask the witnesses? What do I want to know? This is not for you. It's not for the judge. It's for the jury, right? I mean, I don't want to talk about your selling, but you are trying to figure out how best to communicate and share your client's story with them. So if you think through the common thread, we talked about Stephen Bingham. You made a conscious decision to learn to trust each other on that park bench in Golden Gate Park, but you didn't want him to sort of share with you that first emotional, why did you return? You wanted the jury to hear that. Whether it came out well or came out garbled, you wanted the jury to hear that for themselves. Second was during the Dolores Churchill case. Two things. You wanted the jury to hear her and her tell her story, but you also wanted the jury to hear you confront this abuser with the question that we all want to ask, which is now almost in the vernacular, right? Which is that how often do you beat your wife? When did you stop beating your wife? But that was an important question to ask him. You knew it was important because the jury's going to look at you and think, why aren't you asking? And then we just talked about in this case about how this witness wanted to threaten to kill you or do you harm. And you asked that. And I think this common theme throughout it is not just are you yourself, but I think you're really asking questions and speaking in a way that, just from what I've heard and read, that the jurors want. You're sort of putting yourself as a 13th juror. Like, this is what you would think if you were in the jury, you would want to hear or to be asked. Am I wrong? I mean, that seems like a common thread in what I'm hearing is your style in the courtroom.
Well, I'm not sure if I consciously think that, because there are many things, as you well know, as an experienced trial lawyer, that the jury doesn't know about, or they may know about some piece of evidence or some piece of testimony, but not realize its significance. And I've done a fair amount of public speaking, and I've told people that I think of a lawsuit as a piece of abstract art. And the more often you come back to it, the more you'll see in it. And if you have other people look at it, they'll see things that you missed. And so, and I don't believe lawyers have all the answers, and lawyers are not always right. And so I will have people, not just lawyers and not just men, and not just adults. I'll run facts by all kinds of people because I may or may not agree with them, but I try to be always open to other perspectives. And talking about, jury, people will ask, I'm sure it's happened to you, you've been asked, well, when's the trial going to start? And what people are thinking about, when's the first witness going to testify? Or when's opening statement going to happen? But to me, the most critical part of a trial is jury selection. Because in my view, it doesn't matter what the evidence is, it doesn't matter what the law is, if you don't have a jury that's willing to accept it. And you know that jurors will lie in jury selection. They'll either lie to get off or they'll lie to get on. And, and then you probably read, there was just a fairly dramatic example of that in the Bingham case.
Yes.
Of a guy who was lying to a judge. And then when I was able to find out about that, and the judge allowed me to bring him back to establish it, and then the judge discharged him, and he was walking out of the courtroom, and just as he got to the door, he turned back to the judge and he said, if you think these people are telling you the truth, you're out of your mind.
Let me ask you about the interesting segue into the Robert Blake case. Robert Blake played Beretta. A classic Hollywood guy. Good looking guy. It seems as though he kept his hair, looked like he kept his looks all throughout. He played a tough guy on television. That was his character.
He also played the murderer in the movie In Cold Blood.
So there you go. So, and there's this idea somehow that actors are capable of acting and being able to tell a line during their in their own personal lives. That's debatable whether they are or they aren't. I'd like to go back, if you would, just tell me, because it's a really interesting story. One, what the Robert Blake case was like. You've had big cases before that, but obviously that was a celebrity trial because it involved an actual celebrity. It's a high profile case because of, it involved Robert Blake. And as I understand it, your meeting with him was sort of, how would you call it? Would you call it inauspicious? Would you call it auspicious? Would you understate it? What was your first impression of Robert Blake when you actually met him?
Well, at the time, as I said, my wife and I were away from the office, and I couldn't afford a secretary at the time, so I would call in and retrieve messages. And one of them was Robert Blake wanted to see me. Well, I was in the Palm Springs area. We had driven down from the San Francisco area, and I thought, he's not going to retain me. Why would he retain me? I'm a little schmuck from Kingston, Pennsylvania, And
selling yourself short, but I get it.
But there's another short shot at me, huh? But I called up a jury consultant who I had worked with on all my significant or major cases since starting with Stephen Bingham. And I thought she might know something about the case because I hadn't been following the case. I was busy with my own practice. And she said, "Oh, Jerry, you'll be perfect. You'll be absolutely perfect for it. Do it." And I remember telling her, said, my beard's real long. And she said, "Well, get a beard trimmer." And I said, "I have a beard trimmer." And she said, "Buy another one." Anyway, after the acquittal, I called her up and I asked her if she needed a beard trimmer. I had an extra one. But anyway, so she talked me into meeting with him. And my wife asked, "Well, how long is this going to take?" I said, 45 minutes to an hour.
Probably hours.
So it was 4.5 hours. And then I finally said to him, "Look, man, we have to drive back. I got to go." And, but he and I connected. And I think the reason he wanted me was that he trusted me. And he felt that a lot of people, professionals and others, had lied to him and taken advantage of him for financial reasons. It was true. And I don't know, we connected two kids from the East Coast. And when my wife and I left, we weren't even out of Los Angeles. And my wife said to me, "He wants you." And the next day he called me up and asked me to represent him. And I said, "Well, let me try to figure out what the fee would be." So of course I called my older brother who knew money. My brother told me what I should charge. I told Robert, and Robert said, "You made me fall in love with you, and now you broke my heart." And so anyway, I didn't get what my brother told me I should get. I got what Robert was offering. And I didn't expect to live in Los Angeles, but when I got down to Los Angeles and I got to see what was going on in the case, I felt I needed to be there. I didn't get any more money for doing it, but I lived in Los Angeles for over a year because I thought that's what was required. Because to me, it doesn't, people will ask me, "Are you in a big case?" My answer is, to my client, every case is a big case, whether it's a misdemeanor or it's a murder. The result of the case may have a dramatic effect on the future of these person's life. So,
You know what I hate hearing? I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I really hate hearing young lawyers. I'll say any lawyer, but I hear it mostly from young lawyers who say, like, in front of their client, "Oh, I'm so excited to go to trial. I can't wait. I can't wait to cross-examine that guy." Having done enough trials and having sacrificed enough hours of my life, my time with my family, my kids, just my whatever. I look at that phrase now is not a phrase of instilling confidence in your client. It really, in a way, is sort of putting your desire to I don't know, practice or show your toughness over the fact that you have someone over there who is not excited to go to trial. Your client would like nothing more than for you to walk in the courtroom and the prosecutor to say, "We give up. We're done. We don't want to try the case." The idea that that somehow you're doing this and "I can't wait," and your client's sitting behind you, the client's not getting confidence from this. They're scared shitless. I don't care who they are. They don't want to see you like I'm sharpening my knives on this, you know what I mean? On a piece of metal.
No, the price that a dedicated criminal defense lawyer pays is enormous. The price that their spouse, if they have one, pays is enormous. The price their children pay is enormous. And I still experience anxiety when I go to trial. After all these years, 52 years of practicing law, because I know you never know what's going to happen. To me, the most terrifying part of a trial is when a jury comes in with the verdict, and you're waiting for them to say
your
what
stomach
the
just
verdict is.
knots, and you feel like I remember a case I tried. I thought that one juror, it was we were convinced that our client, it was in these parts, a pretty big acquittal for it was a huge case here. And I remember I kept looking at this one juror. I just could not get her to connect with me at all during any part of the trial. I kept trying to see if I could make eye contact and if I could, just looking. And I convinced my trial team that the juror did not like me. I was like, "There's no way. This is going to be 11-1. We're never going to convince juror number 8. That's it. She hates me. She hates me." And the jurors come in and they have one of those questions. And they ask one of those questions. "We want to hear this about the law." And thinking, "Oh, this is a horrible instruction. This is a terrible question. This is striking right to the heart of everything that." And by the end, I was like, I remember I'm standing, there's a scene of me like this when the jury says they have a verdict, and I'm sitting like this, and you can see it. And I don't have a very good side profile at all. Not a good silhouette. And I'm sitting like this, and I'm tired. My hands in front of my nose and my mouth. And I'm looking down, and no one can tell from the picture, but my heart is racing. And I can just feel like I'm going to lose my breath. We sit down, and I don't even know why, but I have like a pen out. I don't know what I'm going to write. There's nothing to write. I mean, there's only two options per charge. It's either guilty or not. And when the jurors read the first, I thought, well, we gave him a good fight. That's what I first thought. And then when they said not guilty and then not guilty, I couldn't control myself. I started bawling, crying, like just leaned over, kissed my client on the forehead, hugging him. I was absolutely crying. Like, I don't know what but I mean, it was all, I don't even remember anything about that moment after that, other than what I've seen in the paper, the picture of it. But I was flipping out because you just feel like, right, wow, how wild is it, Jerry? How wild is it that this guy's life just came down to that? Right? I mean, how wild.
Well, it's something I did write about in the book, and it gives you an insight into Robert Blake, because he's viewed as this very difficult person, and he is a complicated guy, and he's got an ego and etc. But if you spent your whole life not knowing whether people were friendly to you because they actually liked you or because they wanted to be near a celebrity, it can do things to you. But when that jury came back, they were waiting for them to come in the courtroom. Robert and I did not take the verdict. I thought should be an acquittal, but I didn't take it for granted. I had people pack up in the 9 days where the jury was out. I had people pack up all of Robert's belongings, because if he got convicted, they were going to have to be sent somewhere. And he sensed my anxiety. He was sitting next to me, and he just leaned over to me and he said, "Jerry, you did everything you possibly could." It's the only time in my career that's ever happened to me. He didn't know whether he was going to be walking out a door into a jail cell or he was going to walk out a door and have his life back. Yet he felt for me. It was very moving.
I have just a couple more questions for you, because I know you're probably pressed for time, and didn't think that I would probably ask you this many questions. But it's fascinating. You've had a fascinating career and life. And I've just enjoyed the conversation immensely, apart from just all the legal talk. Tell me, if you would, how do you prepare and people can read in the book, obviously, about the different cross-examinations you've done in the verdicts, but how do you prepare to cross some of these witnesses? And I'm specifically thinking of each of these cases. You began with some of the witnesses, for example, the alleged hitman, then there were some witnesses in the Robert Blake case who they claimed that there was a certain way for them to, they kept saying that he acted a certain way, but then they said, well, he didn't act the way that he should have acted. In some of the other cases, you began with a specific question. Did you have it all lined up in a way, and just depending on what the witness said? Did you have notes? Do you use notes? Kind of walk me through just your overall process of how you construct cross-examination in cases like this.
I'll organize my examination of witnesses, but just with an outline. I don't write out things because I just want to be me. I want to communicate as me. And I don't want to be reading something, but I don't want to miss an issue or a fact that I need. And so that's what I do. I have an outline and I follow the outline. Now, if something happens during the course of the examination that was something I didn't anticipate, or then, I just deal with it as best I can. I
mean, I thought some of the questions that you asked of some of the witnesses in the Robert Blake case were they were perfect. It seemed like some of the witnesses had at the time that they talked to the police or at the preliminary hearing said that he acted, oh, he was wailing and he was upset and he was saying, help me, my woman's been shot, or something happened to my woman, or something along those lines. But then they came to trial and they said that he wasn't acting the way they thought he was acting, but he wasn't, he didn't seem to be genuine. And yet
Yeah,
you still trap them and you still cross-examine them beautifully.
well, again, you're being kind, but I mean, some of it was recorded because the first person he went to after he found Bonnie called 911. He was asking to call 911, so there's a recording of that you can hear of that exchange. With others, you found other evidence that impeached where these people went and what they did, and whether it was consistent with what they had testified to or inconsistent with what they had testified. There was a doctor who was available who could have helped to perhaps save Bonnie's life. Maybe not, but you don't know unless you try. He was hiding behind a telephone pole.
You know what I don't like? I don't like how people, it seems like in a lot of cases, prosecutors encourage witnesses to use what I like to call, they use normative judgments. They use one witness, well, if it was my wife, I would have run up and held her. And of course, that's not necessarily the case. There are some people that would and some people that wouldn't. And the normative judgments that people use, they don't think about what happened. They think, well, how should this person have acted compared to what I believe I would have done or I would expect somebody to do? And of course, that's just not the case at all. There are people who run this way and people who run that way and people who get their hands dirty and people who don't. Some freeze, some respond immediately to action. Some don't call you at all until there's a tragedy, and some are by your side the entire time until, thick or thin. And I thought you handled all that stuff extremely well. And it was just a pleasure to read your book. I mean, and each of the clients who picked you, they obviously picked the right guy, whether you were you call yourself the schmuck or the, humble guy or the just you but they obviously knew what they were doing. There are many people that are literally walking the streets who could have been wrongly convicted and weren't as a result of your great work.
Well, thank you. But the first time I drove down to Los Angeles after I'd been retained, I remember saying to myself that my goal, I had two goals. One was to get Robert acquitted, and the other was to be the same person and lawyer at the end that I was at the beginning, to not get caught up in the media. I never spoke to the media unless the DA's office spoke to them. I didn't allow Robert to talk to the media, but for one exception, when Johnny Carson died, because they had been very close friends, and I allowed him to make a very brief statement. I just tried to be myself, work really hard, like Sheldon taught me, and be as prepared as I possibly can be. And a lot of times I've tried things and people would say, oh, don't do that. I mean, there's no chance of that succeeding. And my response is, well, if I don't try, you're right. There's no chance of it succeeding. But if
you could go on and on, because there's another case that you tried. I'm just thinking of it now, where everyone thought that a deal was best, and you ended up sitting through case after case of the police officers testifying in preliminary hearings, and their testimony ended up matching to such a degree that you actually asked, the witnesses, is that, I forget how you began it, but you asked the police officers whether this was the case. You remember this case distinctly as opposed to other cases? And I think something along the lines of the witness said yes. And then you went through and identified each report. He had said the very same thing. And it was just, I thought you took a case that probably would have resulted in, it was a different result with a different lawyer, and you turned it into an acquittal.
Yeah, I think maybe what you're referring to is when I was out in Hunters Point, I was representing a young black man who was accused of selling heroin to an undercover police officer, and as well having heroin on his possession when he was arrested along with a bunch of other people. And about 10 or so fellows were arrested at the same time. I kept on delaying the preliminary hearing in my case, making up excuses. I don't remember what they were. And then I collected transcripts of that officer's testimony in all of the other cases. And he, of course, made his testimony, he formed his testimony in order to get the person who was in court that day. So that by the time that he testified in our case, I had 10 different versions of what happened.
Incredible. Jerry, I have a couple of questions I want to end with. First, I know I've asked, I don't know if you've had a chance to even think about it, but if there was one person who you could cross-examine anywhere in the world, or even in history, who would that person be?
That's a hard one. The risk of offending members of your audience, probably Donald Trump would be right up there. Lindsey Graham. After I read what Alan Dershowitz said about Desmond Tutu, I wouldn't mind having Professor Dershowitz on the witness stand.
And I asked that because it just gives some idea of the challenges that you're willing to take on. I know I had a prior guest who said she wanted to cross-examine O.J. Simpson. And I said, why? And she was, because she'd get him to admit it. And then I had others who, some have chosen the president, some have chosen, someone chose a lawyer. I think one even said Clarence Darrow because you give him a chance to meet Darrow. And I thought that was interesting. So if people wanted to, let's first of all, just kind of highlight your book, if you would. The book is called Leaning on the Arc, a journey through
a personal history of criminal defense.
And this is your memoir. And if someone wanted to get it, like me, well, I already have it, but if someone wanted to get it and read it, where would they find it?
Well, you go on Amazon and it's there. And my website has a reference to it. That's mgslawyer.com.
And occasionally from time to time, we get people who call or are interested in having, they have legal cases in other parts of the country, even in California. And if someone wanted to reach you, Jerry, how would they do that?
Probably the easiest way is through my website. But you know, I have a phone number, I have an email address, and they just, you know, I really don't have any, I don't have any illusions about who I am. I really am the same person I was growing up. And I've just tried to hold on to those values. You know, I think one of the reasons Robert had faith in me is I was in a very long-term marriage. And I don't know how many so-called big-time lawyers have successful family lives. And I was once asked by somebody, you know, you won this, you won that. I mean, what was your biggest challenge? And my answer was the biggest challenge was to be the best lawyer I could possibly be while simultaneously being the best husband and best father I can be. It is extraordinarily difficult. I know you appreciate that. It's really, really difficult because there are only so many hours in the day. And it is hell. I mean, I remember days in trial, particularly in Robert's case, where I'm out of town. I don't know people down there, et cetera. And I'm up in the middle of the night, 4 o'clock, you know, preparing. And I'm feeling really sorry for myself. And I just had to get hold of myself and say, hey, you get in the courtroom, nobody's going to feel sorry for you. Just suck it up. You know, this is what you signed on for. you owe it to your client. And such, I've just always tried to be true to those really fundamental principles.
Jerry Schwartzbach, it's been a real honor to talk to you. You've really done so much, and I think that unfortunately the short time that we have to talk on the podcast just doesn't even come close to give us enough time to explore just your whole career. And but at the risk of sounding trite, I do think sometimes you do cut yourself a little short. You are made so many great contributions to the practice of law, and anyone would be lucky to have you by your side, or by their side, I should say. And I certainly consider myself lucky to have you face to face, as it were, on this podcast. So Jerry Schwartzbach doing the criminal is just, again, leaning on the arc. Please look up his book. It's a fascinating tale. And it's been my privilege to have him here on the Killer Cross-Examination podcast. Jerry, thank you so much.